I chose to do this project on a movie called The Butterfly Effect. So the main character's name is Evan Trayborn. He's 20 years old. He's a college student, and he basically grew up with a pretty troubled, traumatic past, which caused him to have some blackouts where he would completely forget what was going on, and it was really concerning. He went to a friend's house one time, and the friend's dad made him do some pretty messed up stuff in a basement, and he completely blacked out, and it's just things like that, and there was really no explanation except for that his father, who now lives in a mental institute, also had the same problem. The blackouts turned out to be his 20-year-old self was able to go back in time into his childhood self and kind of change the sequence of events, just to try to make the traumatic events not as bad or worse sometimes, depending on the outcome. The interesting part in terms of dialogue is that it was his 20-year-old mind speaking through like a 7-year-old's body, which was a really interesting choice from the directors. I thought it was pretty cool. Moving on to setting, it was kind of ambiguous, but somewhere in a small town in the United States, and then the final scene of the movie takes place in New York City. Aside from that, it was, like I said, pretty ambiguous. So the main character, Evan, is the protagonist of the story, and he kind of fits into a couple different archetypes, such as the creator, because he can change the way that things happen, kind of change the course of history through these going back to the blackouts. He can also be seen as the magician because he changes the world around him in a supernatural way, and obviously with a protagonist, he's seen as the hero because he tries to make things right and he has good intentions. Then next is Kaylee, who is Evan's childhood sweetheart. So she is the archetypal lover because her and Evan have a sort of love connection throughout the movie that either works out or doesn't work out depending on the situation and how Evan affects the course of history through these blackouts. Then there's Tommy. He's Kaylee's brother, and he's the antagonist of the story. So he is seen as the outlaw archetypally. Then there's a character, Lenny, who's just a neighbor and a friend, and I said that he's more so a placeholder than an actual drawn-out character, just because you don't really know much about him. He's kind of a weird presence, but archetypally he can be seen as the innocent, the jester, and the everyman, just because he adds a bit of comedic relief, but he also he insinuates the plight of man just in his actions. The movie's title, The Butterfly Effect, is a metaphor in itself. It was a term coined by Edward Norton Lawrence, who was an American mathematician. It was likening the flap of a butterfly's wings to having a huge impact on the world as we know it. Kind of like something small affecting something huge. And that was kind of the premise that the whole movie went off of. And then for symbols, there were a couple. The blackouts that Evan experienced are symbolic of the repressed memories and the horrible trauma he went through as a child. And the insane asylum where his dad lives, called the Sunnyvale Insane Asylum, is referenced throughout the movie because in different scenarios, his father ends up there, he ends up there, his friend Lenny ends up there, and it's symbolic of the internal battle that Evan experiences between trying to create the best possible outcome for everybody while unknowingly becoming more and more like his father. In terms of imagery, the producers do a really good job with the use of imagery. In particular, they use nosebleeds when Evan wakes up from his blackouts, which shows that even though he's trying to do the best for everyone else, he's really hurting himself and he's hemorrhaging his brain. There wasn't really any super specific filming, but there were a couple close-up shots for when Evan would wake up with the bloody nose, or there was one particular shot that was a long shot to show a mailbox blowing up, and it was one of the childhood trauma moments. there really wasn't. The only scene that I can recall is when Kaylee and Tommy's dad makes all the kids go down to the basement because it looks more like a dungeon, and he ends up attempting to film them doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and it's significant of evil and darkness. So I guess that was the one thing that really stood out. There was one scene that I think is important. It was it's literally the first scene in the movie. It's just text, and it has the definition of chaos, which is really important because you kind of forget about it as the plot goes on, but at a certain point you realize, oh, the chaos is that as things happen and small insignificant things happen, they can ultimately have a huge effect on things and make everything go awry. So to conclude, I think that the archetypes are really a big part of it. With the main characters all fit into really distinct archetypes, and it showed what I didn't realize until the end is that it showed Evan's story as a hero's journey archetype, where he's like the hero and he's trying to save the day. So I thought that that was really prominent looking back on it. I think that people should see this movie because although it deals with the impossible and the supernatural, it was really interesting insight into the trouble surrounding mental illness, and also as the title suggests, it shows in a really interesting way how the smallest insignificant event can cause a huge monumental shift.